Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Take Up. Today we have episode 36, Stitch Types and Motifs in Machine Embroidery. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Take Up. I am sorry for that late start that we just had. It turns out we had some issues getting StreamYard connected, but now that we are here and things are working, I am ready to talk all about stitch types. And honestly, this is something that I've talked about many times. It's something that I'm sure we're going to talk about again. I've titled this one Stitch Types and Motifs because I want to talk about some motif work that I've been doing recently and some things I've been discussing with other people who want to use motifs. But really, I'm going to cover a little bit in general about stitch types. I'm going to talk a little bit about what stitches are and the various natures of stitches, so we can go back to that. Something we certainly covered when we talked about single color design work, things like that. However, I really want to get down to what I consider an elemental level about what the stitch is, because embroidery is the stitch, and it is the one stitch. So we'll get a chance to talk about that as we go on. Like I said, sorry again for starting late, but hopefully we will make up for that with some fun discussion about stitch types, some discussion about embroidery, about rendering, and what we can do with what we have. So here's hoping we have some good stuff to cover today. Like I said, had some technical difficulties, so if I'm a little rattled getting started here, is because we absolutely got close to getting the cutoff. If you guys don't know, like Facebook, when you do something that is scheduled, if you go too far beyond your start time, they will kill your stream. So happy to get that started for you guys in any case. But let's go ahead and say hi to some of the people who have shown up, some of you guys who are diehards, and I would say regulators if you are people who have listened to the Two Regular Guys podcast this morning that I produced. However, we don't really have, I guess, a take-up name. So if you guys want to come up with a name for yourselves, feel free. What I will say is I consider you people to be the cut above, the cream that rises to the top, because you guys are here to get an education. Let's talk to some of you guys as we start. Cindy King, hello, out in Texas. Cindy, hope you're doing well. Hope your weather's well. Hope you're feeling well. And glad to see you in. Christine Shreve, a good friend of mine, and we once co-authored a column back and forth. We traded back and forth in Stitches magazine. We were just talking about that the other day. Good times to be had with Christine Shreve. Good afternoon and happy Friday. Yes, happy Friday to everybody. I know Friday doesn't mean a whole lot to entrepreneurs and those of us who are working our tails off these days, but I will say that I'm happy that you're all here. I'm definitely happy to see you, Christine. Donna Scott Johnson saying, happy Education Friday from Atlanta. By the way, love Atlanta. It's a wonderful town. Got to spend some time there at a previous job. I worked at Deco Network, you guys may know, and their headquarters is just outside of Atlanta, and I really love Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia is a great place. Humid as all get out for this kid from the desert, but definitely a nice place to be. Frank Dunn, Frank from over in the UK across the pond. Good evening, Frank. Hope you have a good one going today. Darren Dimitrov, happy to see you here. Greetings coming in from YouTube. I'm glad to see that because YouTube, we have some issues with comments at YouTube sometimes going live, so I'm glad to see you in here, Darren. Aaron saying hello. Daryl saying nice. Daryl Garcia, who is always a nice person and a positive influence himself. Love to see him there. Lisa Shaw, wow, it gets me nervous because Lisa, as you may know her from Embrilliance, and I am in the Embrilliance studios, as you all know, does incredible live work herself, talking about all these things and talking about digitizing and creating and working with Embrilliance software. So great to see Lisa in. I will not try and butcher your name. If you can give me a pronunciation, sir, I will absolutely try and do it better. Akinluyi. I hope that I'm close, my friend. 9 p.m. here in Nigeria. It is just after 2:39 here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, up in the mountains here. Jeff saying hello. Facebook was slow with the notification. Well, I was slow getting on, so together we're both slow. All right. Cindy saying beautiful weather. Wish I was outside, but glad she is able to be here. Absolutely glad to have you here. And Mike Muldowney also here. Aloha, Mike. Happy to see you. Well, with that, guys, let's get into some of the discussion of what we're going to talk about here today. Stitch types, right? Stitch types. This is something that I've discussed many times. I've actually got a couple of things that I will show you. I've got some articles that I wrote more in the home craft market at one point. But if you have been around me for some time, you know that I teach this even in my full-on commercial classes where I'm talking about digitizing. I break it down to stitch types pretty often because I find when I'm discussing digitizing with everybody, frequently there are some difficulties people have with selecting what stitch types to use for things and with understanding stitch types in general. I think that most of us who have been if not raised on an embroidery machine, who have spent some time operating embroidery machines, spent some time embroidering, and definitely those who have been digitizing for some time, have no problem understanding the nature of stitches and how machines work. But when people first start, and when they first start digitizing, really frequently, they have some issues where they are not sure how to break up designs into different shapes. And I'm here to tell you that even the rules that I give are guidelines. I've given guidelines many a time to say, all right, how big, how wide, how large a space am I trying to cover? Would I use a certain particular stitch to cover it? People tend to know. If you're looking for something that is columnar, a long, skinny rectangle of border, generally we're going to use a satin stitch, right? And we're looking for a tiny, fine line, we're generally going to use a straight or a manual stitch. That's not hard to say. Underneath a millimeter, 0.8 mils, we're probably going to use a straight stitch of some kind, a running stitch of some kind. When we're talking about a large area that needs to be filled in, we're generally going to use some sort of fill, seating, or stepped stitch. There's going to be something that's used to cover large areas. The thing is, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that at all. And if you have been around and listened to me talk about digitizing for dimension before, you know that I talk frequently about using satin stitches or rough split or length limit stitches to fill in areas or to overlap multiple stitches in an area to create coverage. And I'm going to talk about that again today because motifs are another way where we can do that. People know about using motifs decoratively. They don't always think about using motifs for coverage. But suffice it to say, I want to go back. I want to back it down to what a stitch type is in machine embroidery. Before we go any further, I would like to start there, right? Let's start with stitches as they are. The first thing is, if you guys don't know, the reason why I call my website, if you haven't seen my website, and I'll go ahead and bring it up on screen because why not? Here is my stock design website that has very few designs on it. I'm actually adding some right now. I had a lot of requests after last week's show. If you didn't see last week's show that talked about Viking Age motifs and Germanic embroidery motifs, last week's show on the Take Up, I talked all about Germanic motifs and insular art and stuff that's from my kind of medievalist background. If you don't know, I once was a medievalist in training before I became an embroidery person as I am now. I don't know what to say. A guru is what they say to me, and I don't love it because I feel like I am an eternal student and always testing and trying and doing new things. But before I started the pathway to talking too much about stitches, I was in medievalism, as you may know. So this is where my designs come from. But you may understand that my name for my design collection has always been The Only Stitch. The reason I call it The Only Stitch, and if you see the little icon that's up here on the left-hand corner, if you want to call it the company logo for The Only Stitch, refers to the fact that there really is only one stitch in machine embroidery. And everybody's going to tell me, well, no, there's at least 3 stitch types, and then there's a bunch of these other stitch types. I'll talk to you about those, but the truth of the matter is there really is only one stitch, machine embroidery. And you can see right here, this is representing, of course, the top thread and the bottom thread. Now, what you're going to tell me is this looks more like sewing than embroidery because I don't have enough top thread coming down to the bottom on my logo. I know, guys. It's figurative. It's a piece of art. It's not supposed to be the actual stitch there. It's not. This is not a display of proper tension. I'll let you know that first. However, I am just going to go back and let you know. This is why I always bring this up, because people come to me and talk about stitch types. They talk about different things that they always kind of get in their heads about stitching, especially if anybody has ever encountered hand embroidery. They don't think about the fact that you can only work, number one, on an embroidery machine, you're only working on the front surface of the material. You're not working behind it. Somebody will come up and bring up bobbin work or shadow work or something like that. Yes, you can do that. You can do things that are interesting on both sides. But the thing is, you're never working in loops on top of the material. You're never tying knots. You're never able to move that needle. All you can make is a point-to-point line. And here's the thing. The embroidery machine, as we know it, and I'm going to go to the Wikipedia page for sewing machine. Why? The machine embroidery machine, we know it. Yes, there is a lot more technology out there. Trust me, talking to the guys at ZSK, there's stuff that makes your head spin as far as what they're doing with computer vision and what they're doing to work on compensating for all the forces that are going on in an embroidery machine. Absolutely, there's a lot more brains to it. But when we're talking about the very basics, it's incredibly similar to the first sewing machines. Now, we're not talking about the old school machines that were done before the lock stitches we know now, but lock stitch machines that look like this, these type of machines, the original machines, are not much different in mechanism than what we have now. And everybody has seen this, right? If you haven't seen this, go ahead and watch it now. Have some fun. Enjoy the formation of a loop, the formation of a lock stitch, the way we have it in any commercial sewing machine, any embroidery machine that you've seen, these things are absolutely what's going on. Now you can see tension on this. This is meant for sewing. The tension is made so that the top thread and the bottom thread are meeting in the middle of the two fabrics, as you can see here. For us, of course, we know that our tension has our top thread going more to the bottom, but this is still the case. This is the basic mechanism by which we are forming a stitch. The thing that lets us know is that we can only make one stitch on a regular embroidery machine. Now, we can talk about chenille machines some other day. We talk about actual chain stitching some other day. Today, we're talking about a normal lock stitch embroidery machine, the kind that we all are familiar with generally, right? This is all you can do. You can make one stitch. This is it. That goes from point A to point B and is straight. That is all there is. There is only one stitch that is available. We can start from one point and we move our fabric. As we all know, we move the pantograph, which moves our material, doesn't move the needle. And the apparent position of the needle on the workpiece moves from one place to another place and drops one straight line. And it is straight. There is no curving of stitches. There is nothing you can do but make one straight line of a single solid colors thread, unless we're talking about color reel or something else like that. And we're not. We're talking about regular thread, regular lock stitch embroidery machine. This is all we can do, one stitch. And so what can we do with that one stitch? Every other stitch type that we create, everything else we make that is beyond that stitch is all about how we arrange these stitches. So what do we have, right? We've got straight stitches or manual stitches. We're talking about a manual stitch. That's us manually plotting in. The reason we call it manual now is because though we digitize, we understand that we can draw a line and we can draw a shape and have it be filled automatically, programmatically by our software with stitches. And so when we say manual stitch, it means that we're going to manually define the start point and the end point of every stitch that we're going to put in sequence, right? That's what a manual stitch is. Otherwise, we have a running stitch. Common stitch for us, running stitch. It is just stitches with a set length that approximate the line we draw. And I'm saying approximate on purpose because, as we know, all we're doing is putting straight lines that follow as closely as they can, according to parameters, the line that we draw. Are they following it perfectly? Absolutely not. What we're making is a polyline. We're making a line made of small straight lines, and those small straight lines follow the line that we draw that could be a true curve as closely as they can. This is why we have things like automatic stitch shortening, that as we make a really tight curve, the stitches get shorter. Why does that happen? Because we end up with these little teeny tiny stitches that in order to follow the curve more tightly. So we have a thing called chord gap. It's that gap off of that drawing that we made, that line, the actual curve. And that's the thing. Essentially, all we're making is that single stitch. So here we are. What is a running stitch? A running stitch is a line of those stitches end to end that is generally set with a length that we can set in a parameter, and it gets as close as it can to the curve. That's our running stitch. What is a satin stitch? A satin stitch, essentially, usually it's on a columnar item, it's like a narrow column or a border or something like that. It is a straight stitch that goes roughly perpendicular across it, and we can talk all about angles and things and what that means for different terminology. But generally, a satin stitch has a straight line that goes roughly perpendicular across the two edges of that column, and then an angled return that goes back across, and it advances the position of the needle, the apparent position of the needle, by the density, by the spacing between the rows of stitching. And that's it. We have a straight line and an angled line back, and then we repeat that. That is a satin stitch. And what are the things we can change about that? Well, once again, stitch length. Same thing we change with any other kind of stitch. The width of a satin column is what? The length of that straight stitch. That's what we're actually setting when we're setting that and when we're drawing it. The other thing we can set is how close together they are. That's density. So all we really have changed here, we have length, we have how close together they are. Because of the way a satin stitch is defined, the angular relationship between them is going to be roughly parallel between the straight stitches and then have an angled return between them. That's it. So that's about what that is. And, I'm going to go ahead and answer a question here. Mike says, technically satin and zigzag are not the same, correct? Yeah, generally not. And that's just the way that they're made. Do they look similar? Yes, they look very similar. A zigzag generally is using the same angle, which is like half the density rating or half the density setting, back and forth. They're both angled stitches. If they get really tight together, are they indistinguishable from a satin? Pretty much. But a zigzag is not technically exactly the same as a satin stitch. Satin stitch is going to have that straight line across, and the way it's defined is because if you looked at it, every other stitch is going to be parallel to each other. And why is it called a satin stitch? Because like a satin weave in a material, they are long, unbroken stitches. And as we know, long, unbroken stitches, long, unbroken threads are shiny. That's why a satin looks like it does, because the face of a satin piece of material has long, unbroken threads that are not weaving in and out. They are laid on top of the weave, and that's how we get a satin. That's how we get a shiny material. Same thing as a satin stitch. That's how we get our shine. So yeah, absolutely. That's what I like to say. So Mike, yeah, technically satin zigzag are not the same. I also want to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and show your other column, Mike, since you brought that in here. Mike says, there is only one stitch is also what I used to argue what machine embroiders better. None of them, they all make the same stitch. It's all the other stuff attached to the machine that makes one machine appeal to one person. Or sorry, off topic. You know what I'll say is there are machines that do more, do better, have more technology put into them, that have machine parts that are more precise, more accurate. What I am going to say is that it's not what makes your design different. That's not what's going to change your design. That's not going to mean I make better embroidery. It does not happen because of your machine, or truthfully, just because of your software. I've seen masterpieces come out of all manner of things. The difference is my machine reliable enough, or does it have, like you said, other things that are attached to it? Usually it's not the mechanism of making a stitch. It's the mechanism surrounding it. Is the tension really reliable? Are the movements reliable? And do they hold up? Do we have other attachments or things that enhance our abilities with the machines? Those are really important. And of course, service. So I was talking about with machines, and I'm not going to get into machines deeply, but the service that we get, the education that we get, the ability to have them repaired, the parts being in stock, those are also important too. But let's go ahead and keep on going with the design stuff and stitches. Last couple of things, I'm not going to keep beating this dead horse, but we talk about the big three stitch types, and everybody wants to kind of say, okay, we've got the big three stitch types, right? We've got straight stitch, we've got satin stitch, and we've got fill stitch. Well, what is a fill stitch? Well, a fill stitch is a set of rows of stitching set apart from each other. There are parallel rows of stitching in general that are set apart from each other by a set spacing. This is our density. They go back and forth across an area. And the thing that's different about a fill stitch, at least as it's executed and also as it is done by software, is that it intelligently sets the stitch penetration points in reference to the other lines around it. So what does this mean? If we're looking for a standard tatami stitch or fill stitch, it means that the stitch penetration points don't line up from row to row, so we don't get big bricks of stitches. We have these offset penetration points, which gives a smooth appearance. But as we all know, creatively, we can use the way that those penetration points are set either to make bricks of stitching on purpose, where we line up those lines of our stitch penetration points so that we get a texture, or we can make them rough or randomized so we get a more organic look to our fill by having long and short stitches interspersed together in a random fashion. So we can change the look of them, but the essence of the fill stitch still is rows of stitching to go back and forth across an area that are set apart from each other by a set distance, which is our density. All density is. That's another one of the measurements that causes people problems because of the way that it's measured. All density is a measurement of the space between rows of stitching. That's it. It's a little different in the way that it's depicted in satin stitches and in fill stitches, but that's all density is, which also means even if we are looking at something like a field of manual stitches we draw ourselves or motif stitches that we draw ourselves, we can take the overall measurement of how much stitching is in an area and consider that density. It's the spacing between rows of stitching. This can be density, and density and coverage are slightly different. Density as it's expressed in numbers for fill stitches, for satin stitches, that is specifically spacing between rows of stitching. Whereas we can also look at coverage, whereas it's not a number we can set, it is just a density, it is a coverage, it is the overall space and how much of the ground fabric is obscured by our thread. That's coverage. They're not exactly the same, but they're very closely related because the spacing between the stitches is, of course, going to let you know how much space we have available. The thing is, we could be using other forms like underlays to hold up or cover up that material without it being related just to the density of the top fill. But what we've essentially come across is this, right? If we know we can only make one stitch, and that single stitch is 1 point from line to line, from point to point, we have one straight line. That's all we have. It is of a solid color in general, unless there's something being done to dye the thread differently. It is one color from line to line. We know that everything we do now all we can do is decide how we're going to combine these stitches, right? A lot of what we do is designed by our tools. The tools are going to give us what a satin stitch looks like, a zigzag. We're going to have, like, and eventually we'll get into motifs and these things as well. But that's what was going to help us understand how to fill areas, surely, or it's going to be how we fill areas quickly. But if we don't forget, we shouldn't forget that people used to digitize things manually. They used to sit down and they had a 6:1 image. And I was hoping to bring this up, and I actually didn't have time to scan this. I may try and get this here. People used to draw out and cartoon. I'm actually going to hold this up. This is a book from Coleman Schneider. It's something that I want to bring to you guys at some point. But what we can see here, right, if you check this out, this is someone with drawing tools, with, I believe, a French wheel, who is setting up spacing, who is drawing for someone. And you can see that's actually a Levi's logo. They are showing someone the spacing between stitches, because we used to do it all manually, stitch by stitch, when we were punching. Back in the day, we were punching on big boards. We did everything one stitch at a time, no matter what. Now our tools sometimes inform us, and it means we may overuse stitch types. We may change the way we actually look at art and interpretation, because we know we're not going to be moving stitch by stitch. But I would like you guys to all think stitch by stitch, even when we're using tools that work with those stitches by stitches. And actually, I'm going to bring up something Matt says as well. It's a very good point. Density is also measured throw to throw, and I always call it courses or passes, not including the return. So when we're talking about a satin stitch, remember we talked about the satin stitch across and then that angled return? That entire distance between the two parallel stitches, that's the density, not each row. So when you're looking at a fill, it's not each row. Each row of stitching is half the density measurement. It's pass out and then the return. It's the run out and then the return together gives you the density. It's absolutely true. And I can bring that up later if you want to see that, guys. If you've been in any of my classes, you've already seen me talk about those things. And yeah, the AB Emblem videos, absolutely. If you haven't seen AB Emblem, it's like a storied emblem company in the US. They make all the emblems for NASA. I actually did an interview with those folks and wrote an article based on some of their history. And if you look at it, they have like I said, they have these things that used to be called somebody who did cartooning. They would draw up a draft. Think of anyone doing architecture. They're drawing up this draft, this plan that is a 6:1 size of the actual embroidery. And in there were all of these special notations to show you densities, things like that. They would show you those parallel lines, and you would digitize the return yourself, but it would show you how many stitches per inch were supposed to be in an area, or stitches per line, or lines per inch, whatever it is that they measured it in. And you would actually measure it out on this measured drawing and draw it all stitch by stitch. The thing is, yes, it was very, very slow, but it had an incredible amount of control, and they understood what they were working with: stitches, straight lines, and they drew with them. And I think it made it easier for people who are interpreting art, because they knew what they were working with, and they also knew that they could rely on the manual stitch readily when they went to work on things. I think, honestly, even when we talk about motifs, which is coming up here shortly, motifs in this case, once again, these are repeated blocks of stitches, and often manual stitches. Making motifs is much more like digitizing manually than anything most people do. And I think the advent of a computerized, not only embroidery machines, but sewing machines that had motif stitches, motif borders, anyone who's done things like crazy quilting or all that in the kind of craft space, you've seen these collections of decorative motif stitches. The thing is, you can use motif stitches for more than that, and you can do different things with them, because you can set these manual stitches up in collections and space them and work with them in a way that is a little bit more like that original manual work. It's not as good or as strong as programmatically made motifs. So what I'm going to say is that inside of software, there are things that programmers do. Brian Bailey has made some motifs that work incredibly well and allow for things like traveling around inside of a design past the border of the individual motif and back through, working on, let's say, how many repeats over a line there is. There are things that are done in software that you can't necessarily do by drawing your own small motif block. So it is not really a way to replace the things you can do programmatically. And honestly, there are times where I've done stuff with motifs that then I look at what people have done with programmatically handling the same sort of questions and problems, and they're usually better results, because they can do things like calculate densities in different areas, calculate densities on the edge, work with warping around shapes that you don't really do with a motif, because a motif really is like using a rubber stamp, right? First, let me kind of define motifs there. I want to go back and finish a little talk about the stitching. But when I define a motif here, in machine embroidery, as we understand it now, a motif stitch generally is a grouping of stitches. It can be different types of stitches if we're using different stitch types, but people often do program these manually. They usually punch these manually or with Sometimes you're also using satin blocks, things like that. But even when I do satin blocks of stitches, I may elect to do these manually. These kind of motifs are the things that are generally done in small blocks, and they are repeated along a path. Now, I know someone's going to tell me, what about a motif fill where it's in an entire area? Even with a motif fill that's an entire area, what it's really doing is taking the area that we're talking about. Let's say we're talking about an entire box, and we're drawing paths inside of that box and then running the motifs along the path. Motifs, as we understand them in most digitizing software and in most programs, they're going to be a linear item that's very much like a rubber stamp, in that you're going to just place these blocks along a path, and they're going to follow that path as best they can. There may be some warping or other things that we can do to motifs through our software, but when we think about motifs, that's really how we want to get to them. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about designing those shortly, but let's go back to stitches for just a second before I leave them, right? When we talk about stitches, one more time, stitch types, I'm going to stress one more time, there is only one stitch that you can make on a modern embroidery machine. The only stitch is one line. It is a line from point A to point B. Everything else is how we manipulate those lines and how we let our software do that manipulation for us. So there is something to that. Whenever somebody comes back and says, no, there's not, there's multiple types of stitches. You know what? I'll actually hear that, because truthfully, the tools that we use inform how we lay stitches down. It's also why too many people have a tendency to see a big complex shape, grab a fill tool and say, start here, end here, one angle, and fill it, because it's the easiest way to get from a blank, empty shape to a large area filled with stitches. It's the easiest way to manage it. And so I'm not going to argue and say that why people do that. Of course they do that, because it's an easy way to go from no stitches to stitches, because the software handles all the pathing and breaking things up. One of the reasons I probably don't use fill stitches as much is that baked into my core, when I first started, the software I had, even with fill stitches, as we know, fill stitches, the rows that go back and forth, my software did not make a fill stitch with a hole in it. Whenever I had an object like a donut with a hole in the center, right? I have an object with a hole in the center. I had to stop at a certain point where I could go. I was like, okay, up to the bottom of the hole, that's one fill stitch. Now I'm going to stop here. I'm going to draw a new block that's the side of this hole and fill it. Manually travel back down to the bottom, draw a new block that's this side, and then I'm going to draw one more block at the top that is all continuous and doesn't have a hole in it. Any fill with a hole in it was probably 3 to 4 blocks of fill stitching for me. And that's the thing. The software now does complex fills with holes. All software does it. It's not uncommon. But the thing is, it wasn't always common. Even with software that did digitizing, even past the point of punching, there was a point to be done that way. And here's the thing. Because of that, if you ever have to think about how to break up a shape into smaller shapes, even for fills, I think it is the beginning of understanding that any object you see, any area that must be filled with stitches in your art can be filled with stitches with any type of stitches you want in any way you want, provided you get the coverage you want and the surface quality you want. So that's the first thing. I've said this a million times, guys. Don't think about art as this block that is vector that is here. Think about the area you want to fill with stitches and how you're going to make marks with those stitches that fill that area. It doesn't have to be a continuous block of fill. And in fact, it very often shouldn't be, in my opinion, if you want to get the best look out of your embroidery or the most textural visual interest. And here's the thing. When we're working with these individual stitches, I'm not saying we're going to go back to manually punching everything. What I want to say is that you're going to go back to understanding what makes a stitch look different, understanding what makes a stitch type. A stitch type is a grouping of stitches. And actually, I'll tell you this, I'm looking back at my notes. There's so much that I have here that I actually took. I've got handwritten notes today because I have some things that I really wanted to cover. And here's the thing. The grouping of stitches that have relationships to each other that we define, right? When we're using tools, we can absolutely say that the tools help us define them. A satin stitch tool is going to take a columnar input or a shape, and it's going to make the satin stitch for us. We're not going to draw those. However, we are still going to define the relationships to each other by setting stitch angles. Will tell us how stitches change in angle to each other as they go through this column. We're going to set our densities, and if we have density tools, including things like accordion or gradient densities, those are ways in which we are controlling how far apart those stitches are. So the stitch type is there. The base nature of the stitch type is how it draws across the shape and how it returns. the way it handles stitch penetration points, and the way it handles angles in relationship to each other. This is what's going to make our stitch type look like what it is. And this includes things like motifs. A lot of times we're talking about motifs. They're performing a function that creates a certain kind of surface texture. It fills in a certain way, or it performs an actual function. Because, hey, a buttonhole is a motif. It's a collection of stitches that run in a certain pathway we want it to be, but that actually performs a very specific function. We're going to cut a slit into our material, and we want this buttonhole to reinforce the edge. For construction sewing, we know what that is, but that is very little different than embroidery, except for that we're generally using it in a decorative function, right? That's usually what we're doing. So when we talk about this stuff, really what we're saying is stitch types are collections of stitches, and these individual stitches either programmatically done or done by us if we're creating our own motifs that are made in a way in which gives us a certain kind of surface texture, a certain kind of shine, a certain kind of coverage that we're looking for. And everything under the sun falls under that grouping. We're just defining the relationships between the individual stitches, and quite often we're letting the software do a lot of that heavy lifting for us. So that's stitch types in general. Can we go over stitch types in a basic way? We certainly could if we wanted to. I often, like I said, these are the ones that I usually show people. I'm going to jump over here into some slides that I've done before. If you've been in any of my classes, especially in my debate and digitizing classes here, I covered this. Really quickly, I'll just show you some of the stitch types, but I'm not going to go over them. Straight manual stitches are used for line work fairly frequently. Why? You have little tiny thin lines. Straight stitches are going to be the way you get the thinnest line you can get in embroidery, of course, because the thinnest line you can make is a single pass of thread. If you're trying to offset your stitch penetration points so they don't line up, then the thinnest line you have is 2 passes of thread almost right on top of each other. So straight and manual stitches are going to be used for this kind of work. And like I said, manual stitches are great because they don't all fall in one direction or approximate a curve. We're going to set where they go, and you can do natural details. So here's your straight stitches, less than 8.8 mils. Good idea to use straight stitches, especially if we're talking about 40 weight thread. That's going to be a really great line that we can kind of call for ourselves. And like I said, what can we change about them? Length. Longer ones are shinier. The shorter ones have a little darker shadows in them, especially in light colors, and they're going to look more pebbled. Satin stitches, elements thinner than 10 millimeters, often, or thicker than 10 millimeters, thinner than 10 millimeters, thicker than 0.8 millimeters. So 1 mil is a good line for that, especially with 40 weight thread. Things are cylindrical. Satin stitch is a good choice. Here we can see once again, here's our parallel lines right here. And let's see, I can turn on pointer focus. I always forget to do that, guys. That's something I've only had the last few episodes as a way to show you guys my pointer a little better. Here we are. You're going to see that we have these lines are our parallel lines here, and these angled lines are our returns. That's what I was talking about with the satin stitch. But once again, these are all just individual stitches, just like they always are. And honestly, natural choice for all of these elements, borders, things like that. High shine, edge shadows, as we know. Satin stitches, great to be used for all sorts of things. You can see I've got overlapped satins in here. I've got some splitting in here, certainly, but the texture doesn't change the fact that these are by and large satin stitches. Though even when you look at things like an auto split satin stitch, essentially, if you really look at it under the microscope of looking at it in your software, auto split or length limit satin stitches with an edge pad, usually what you actually have is something that operates very much like a satin stitch on the edge of a wider column. And then in the center, what you have is very much like a tatami stitch. You have some offset penetration points. So we really just we're defining inside of one column, we're kind of defining different stitch types within the outer edges and the center. So even an auto split or a flexi split or a length limit with edge padding satin stitch, these things are just essentially saying, where am I going to drop my penetration points? How is my stitch length going to look? Are they going to be lined up, or are they going to be offset so that I get that smooth texture? So no matter what we're talking about, we're kind of still dealing with the same stuff here, folks. So there's our satin stitches. Even when we have some texture there, they are fairly similar. And as you can see, if you haven't seen this piece before, here's your chance to check it out. The Heart of a Lion piece that I show fairly frequently, because I did fill every single bit of this thing with satins of some variety or length limit split satins of some variety. None of this, and this is a full-size jacket back, none of this is done with fill stitch whatsoever. And that's one of those things I always tell people, you do not have to fill a big area with fill stitch just because it's big. So there's your effects. There's your original art, easy to see. And like I said, split length, length limit, split satins, fairly often they have a satin-like edge, which is an unbroken edge. that is lined up with the penetration points, and then offset penetration points on the inside to give a smooth look, very much like a tatami fill, but it is not lined up, so you don't get big carving lines. So, very, very similar stuff. Very similar stuff. And fill stitches, once again, here we go. And this is stuff, remember Jeff talked to us and he commented on the fact that density is measured from course to course or from run to run. Density here would be measured from edge to edge here, but as you can see, that is one line out. This chisel tip is like the angled return on that satin stitch, and there's the return line. Once again, we get this little chisel here down to a point, and then back. This measurement between these two, that's our density. But once again, all we have are these elements that lay flat to the garment. They are offset penetration points, so we don't get excess texture. That's the idea, and they're often used for things also like gradients for blending. Why? Because we're trying to layer stitches together and we want them to fall in together. If we have any offset and angle, then one stitch will sit up on top of the other. Why? Stitches, threads are a physical object. Physical objects sit on top of each other. They do not blend together like ink or like paint or like dye. They must be physical. And because of that, the only way to really, really blend threads is for them to fall into each other like this. They need to be able to pass into each other, and that means a single angle. And if you want everything to be roughly parallel like that, well, the fill stitch is like that, whereas, as you know, the satin has that angled return, and the angled return here is going to sit on top of other straight stitches below it if you try and blend satins. Can you blend satins? Yes. One of the reasons it doesn't always work very well is that satins will have that angled return and it sticks out like a sore thumb when it sits on top of the color underneath it. So these are just some basic things to think about. And I showed you this one when we talked about the other piece, the Viking pieces last week. As you can see, these are still, of course, only made with one stitch, but the difference we have are the angles in relation to the stitches around them, the way the penetration points are set to the stitches around them, and the combination of these different qualities they produce in order to give us visual interest, to give us that shine, that shadow. And like I said, we have one color of gold here, one color of brown, and then the darker color aside from, we do have the darker outline and then the darker outline color here. And then of course the straight stitch outline. So we got 4 colors here, but we're getting all of the different colors on that piece. Like I said, and guys, I am going to bring you some new designs soon. I know I show you a lot of the same stuff because it's instructive. I think it's a very instructive piece, and this piece was specifically made to show these differences, but there will be some new stuff to show you as well. But let's go back. I'm not going to go into auto digitizing. Everybody knows if we get into digitizing, I'll start grousing about auto digitizing. This is a good example of breaking up your shapes, though. Why you don't have to just fill with one area, fill with one kind of stitch. But let's go back and talk about motifs and such. Like I said, I like to talk about stitch types, and I have often talked about all these different things. As you can see, I've shown people this very animation many times, and we can look at all these stitch types together. The thing is, no matter what we're doing, when we're talking about these stitch types, it's really about the qualities we're trying to evoke. And we're trying to say, all right, even when we have one kind of thread, so the thread is not producing anything, the color is not producing anything, and this is something you'll definitely see in the other take-up episode I did about single color designs. Even when the thread doesn't lend us any of that visual quality, we still can create different quality in our designs, create dimension through the use of different stitch types. But as we know, these stitch types are really arrangements of stitches and understanding things about how stitches look, depending on the angles they're set at, how close together they are, and how long or short they are, because it's really all we can change. But let's talk a little bit about motifs, guys, right? We talked about a little motif stuff before, but I think I'd like to talk about more if I can. And hopefully, I think, let me see here. I may have not pulled up the right. There we are. Here's some of the right images to pull up. And actually, I have this piece in front of me right now. I have a smaller version of it. I've done 2 versions. I've done a really large version of it, and then I have a shrunken version of this piece. And this is one that I refer to as the Paisley Falcon. It's made with these Paisley kind of shapes, and I'll actually go ahead and bring up, I have a Wikipedia page up for Paisleys. Paisley designs are really common, and it's something that we believe is really, it comes from the Near East and was made very popular later on. And the reason why it's called Paisley, though, it's actually a Scottish town where Paisley textiles were produced as they became very popular in the West. So that's why we call them Paisley, but this is actually a very ancient motif, this kind of pear-shaped motif that people call various things. And that's from the Near East, and it's a cultural motif we see all over the place. The thing is, it has become incredibly common in everything that we have here. We have these Paisley prints everywhere. And for a while there was this kind of trend for Paisleys to be used. And when this trend for Paisley came around, I decided that I wanted to make a kind of fully covered Paisley design piece. And also this was to show, and Christine Shreve knows this because she helped me do this. This was to kind of show the way that we could use metallic threads, because every single piece of this is metallic. And I'll go ahead and go to my full camera here so I can show you, because I actually have, like I said, the smaller version of the pieces here. It's on the back of a black hoodie, as you can see. But this is the smaller version of the piece, and it is done entirely in metallic stitches. So every single piece of this is old school wrapped metallic thread, and I don't think we can get too close, and we're going to have some greens, so obviously that's going to cause some issues on the camera. But you can see it's a fairly large piece, and it actually does have some dimension to it, and there's a lot of little bitty threads involved. What I will say about this is that much of this piece was actually created through the use of repeated motifs that were not done with motif tools. So we did have repeated motifs that were manually set because I wanted to have some swing, some kind of human hand involved. I wanted it to look like a standard printed Paisley, something that was done maybe with wooden print blocks, not super clean, not super mechanical. And you'll see that all of the little pieces, there's all these pieces that are off into the corners, into these tails, into the edges where there are smaller, thinner lines. These were often done with pre-programmed motif stitches. I'm going to show you a little bit about that to discuss this, right? And we'll talk about what you need to do to get motif stitches to do what you want to do. The thing is that all of this texture really was made with very simple curves. I had very simple drawn curves that became part of how this thing came together, but all the texture and all the interest that comes out of this thing. And let me go ahead and pull up the actual image, because I think it's going to be a lot more interesting than looking at it the way I am now. This image is a little bit more interesting, I think, than trying to look at it in any other fashion. But here we are. This is the actual image, and we'll go ahead and go through. And this is actually a different version of the piece than the piece I have now. I've got some improvements I did to it when I made the smaller version. But what we can see as we go across this piece, and I wanted to get up into the feathers, you're going to see all these very simple lines that are in here, right? The color's doing some work. You can definitely see I've got some jump stitches that I left intact. You really don't see that. See much trouble there. We have these little fin type shapes. We have these little maybe shark teeth or thorns, you might want to call these. There are some other versions of the little thorns that are up here, some long thorns, some short thorns, and I made all these names up. This is not like a function of Paisley design. This is a function of me trying to figure out how to call these things. We definitely have some more of these fin shapes. There's a little kind of almost like a blanket stitch up here that's followed with a whip stitch. I also have some of the, there's some of the kind of chain stitch that I've done, which is kind of a faux chain, faux split stitch that I created. All of these were done with motifs. And it's something that I've actually been working with other people on recently within Brilliant Software, because we've been working on our motif engine a little bit and changing some things about that. So it's something that I actually have been enjoying again myself lately, is playing with these motifs. But what you can see is we have these little repeated blocks of stitches where essentially we have a set length, we have a set size, and inside of that we've got some manual stitches that then repeat along a curve, repeat along a shape, right? So that's our motif stitching. And this is actually a very traditional way of using it. We're just describing a curve, and along the curve we're going to keep repeating the same motif. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these things were altered. Sometimes I used more than one motif because of the different areas and shapes I had to fit in. Like I said, there are distinct limitations working with motifs because you're not going to be able to necessarily tailor them to the curve that you're on. You're going to find that sometimes the inside of a tight curve, the outside of a very wide curve, it's going to cause your spacing to increase between, among different pieces of the motif. And depending on what software you're using or how it handles certain things, you may have areas where the motifs don't look exactly how you want. But this is the thing that I'd like to get people on board with. Not only do I want you to say, when I'm looking at an area that I'm going to fill with stitches, that I don't have to fill it with one kind of stitch because of my tools, I also want you to look at a piece and say, I can start with one type of tool and move to another. So I can start with a motif tool, and then if I come to a corner where that motif doesn't work, I can stop the motif, pick up with a manual stitch tool or a straight stitch tool, and draw the pieces I want in that corner that don't work. Instead of just relying on the software, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have software like I do within Brilliance with a Stitch Artist that does a lot of stuff automatically, it's easy to get kind of lazy with it and use all those automated functions and get upset that it doesn't do something you want it to do. When the truth of the matter is, some things really take a human eye, a human hand to do exactly the way you want them. But you can use the motifs to get rid of so much excess labor and then come in and finish into your motif work in such a way where you don't have to do all of that work. You've done all the simple stuff, and then you can go do the fine work yourself. Or you can do as I've done here and say, all right, well, some of these other pieces of the paisley that are further in the background, the head of the falcon, these pieces in the wing that really are kind of in the background, they aren't really the focus of everything here. I'm going to do these with motif stitches so that they're completed very quickly. Also, I can use several contoured rows and build out of several motifs something that looks like it's one motif, but I'm actually building in these concentric shapes out to create the full look and the full texture that I want. And then on pieces that are very important, let's say this big copper paisley that absolutely I wanted to make sure all the over and under and all of the different sorts of texture were handled in the proper way. All that kind of interlace, the way we discussed last week, was handled the right way. That's going to be done manually. I'm going to work on this piece manually so that I can put those satin stitches where I want them. Whereas these little bits of detail over here, this particular piece that falls kind of, and it's part of the texture of the background, I can rely on this automated thorn motif. And if there's a little bit of weirdness in the corner here, because it's not exactly how I would do it manually, that little bit of weirdness does not take away from the design in such a way that I have to go back and fix it. And if I really don't like it, I will go back in, especially when it's 4 or 5 stitches, I will go back in with the stitch editing tool on the final stitch file after I've exported it from my working file when I am in stitches and work on those 4 or 5 stitches and put them where I want them to be, especially when I'm working on a piece that's going to be reproduced over and over again. Now, this piece was a show piece. It was not going to be reproduced over and over again, but I can tell you from having done other fashion work, I've done pieces that are going to be reproduced hundreds or thousands of times. And when you do those, it makes absolute sense to stop and do some minor stitch editing or to massage things with manual tools, even if you're using automated tools to do certain parts of them. So like I said, these little guys, great place to use some motif stitching. And also, as you can see here, if I'm going to cover up with a nice kind of stem stitch around this back area, I can use a motif to make these 4 little hooks if I want to. And it's okay that I'm going to get a little extra coverage because I have to travel between those little hooks, even though I'm going to cover them over on the other, on the next pass. Things don't have to always be perfect. And when they do have to be perfect, it totally makes sense to go back out into tools that are manual and do some of that work or rework into our design, even if we started with manual tools. So like I said, that's really all I want to cover with that, is just to tell you guys that that's the point. And then we'll talk a little bit about creating motifs. And I'd like to show you in software some motif stuff that I've worked on recently and just discuss a little bit about what we need to think about when we're dealing with motifs, right? And hopefully we can also do, I've got some other stuff I'd really like to show you if I can. I'm going to try and bring some things up if I can get to them where I can show you I've actually got a lovely kind of explanation that I'm going to bring over here as well for motifs, so I can discuss that briefly. The graphic didn't work quite as well as I wanted it to here, but we're going to go ahead and bring in software really quick, and we'll talk a little bit about different kinds of motifs and things. And I think it is interesting to discuss. Number one, we'll go ahead and show you what I'm talking about. Here are some motifs, and I'm not joking. I didn't have these set up because I haven't made that paisley piece in some time. I didn't have my original motif set up. So I did within the last minutes before the show went live, sadly, before I was about to find out that I had extra minutes because of the technical problems I had with StreamYard, I stopped and just made these little motifs and published these. I was in Stitch Artist 3, and I can publish motifs pretty quickly. And so over here, you'll see that I have, I've got this fin, I've got a long thorn that's narrow, I've got a short thorn that's narrow, I've got a satin wave and a triangle. I haven't even tested all these yet. I drew this incredibly rough kind of paisley shape. Didn't really work on it very hard. And here's the thing. I'm going to go in there and make this a motif fill, and you can see fairly immediately, if I can make this thing a motif run, how much visual interest I can create with a simple motif. And you can imagine now that if I go back and draw in all of these different shapes, certainly, like I said before, you can see that there are things with this spacing that you might want to play with the spacing. You might want to play with the individual motifs. You might want to do some manual work on it. But by and large, you can see that you get this great amount of visual interest that you can play with just having these motif runs in these continuous curves. So just a simple motif like this, it's something where you might think, I don't need motif publishing, but if you're going to do a lot of work that's figural or gestural or that has that kind of fashion work in it, it is really interesting to be able to publish your own motifs, because that custom motif means that you could then use this piece, you know, endlessly over and over again for different things. And I mean, this is a fairly complicated motif in general, whereas I could go back into this motif set and, you know, let's take this motif back out and I could add this long thorn. Like I said, I haven't tested these. They probably need some work. And I can see here that I've got some spacing issues I might need to work on. line. There's my long thorn. And now if I have something like this set up here where I can actually add multiple motifs, I'm going to add the short thorn after it. And now you can see that I've got a more complex pattern because I can go multiple motifs together in a line, at least in Stitch Artist and in Brilliance you can. And you can see that I can even do things like rotate these. So let's say I flip this one. Now I've got this very interesting motif pattern, and the variations on this are just endless. So you can play with these very simple motifs, and these are all done with manual stitching, right? So all I'm going to show you with that, let me go ahead and take a couple more chances of these motifs. I would like to go ahead and see. Let's see if one of these others works too. I'll take this one off. Let's grab our triangle motif. This is really nice. And then let's say I go ahead and remove this other one. And now I've got triangles that just keep on following the curve. And this is my break point. So you see, I may not have this last motif here. I might have to play with spacing if I wanted them exactly the way I have them there. The thing is, I could even take a second copy of this triangle motif. And if I take that second copy and flip it, now I can have these alternating triangles. Like I said, these are very simple to do. I think they're pretty interesting, and they can come in handy in ways you don't expect. And I would say that things that are a little more complicated, you can even use satinish kind of motifs. And I actually called this one the satinish wave here. Things like this, these little spark lines, really interesting to create texture. And I know I also did a lot of work for, around here we have a lot of native casinos that are around here, and a lot of their work will have pattern figured pieces, and I helped do some uniform work for them. There's a couple places, Fire Rock Casino out here is one of them, where they had big stripes and strips of these motifs that were pottery motifs, and these things were essentially these repeated blocks. So for different sizes of garments, I could actually create a motif once like this and then continually repeat that motif or reuse that motif in other places, other sizes, and use that to create more complicated pieces. I can use it to create a collar tip, a back line, something to go around a sleeve. And it was pretty interesting to have that ability to use those motifs. So without belaboring the point, I'm just going to show you very briefly, once again, some of these motifs and how they're created. But I can go ahead and I'm going to go back to that fin motif. I'm actually quite fond of that because it's kind of complicated. It's not super complicated, but there is a little bit to it, right? This one's all made with manual stitches, and I can go ahead and play this out for you, and I'll go through the originals. But you can see what I'm essentially doing here. The first thing to think about a motif is that a motif is meant to go along a path. We talked about this before. If a motif is going along a path, we have to think of the apparent motion of the motif, right? And one of the things that's interesting about the apparent motion here is that we know this from bean stitches, right? Bean stitches, back stitches. We know that an odd number of bean stitches is going to progress forward. If we have an even number, it wants to go back. Well, that's why when we look at passes or multiple pass stitching, it'll say 3, 5, 7 are the settings. Why is it 3, 5, and 5 and 7? Well, if I go one stitch out and one stitch back, I'm back to where I started from. 3 stitches gets me at the end point again, and now I can keep going forward. So 1, 2, it keeps going like that. So you go jumping 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and I keep on progressing forward. The same thing happens with your motif stitches. If you go all the way across and then back, you're going to find out that you actually can't maintain forward motion along the path, and you're going to have jumping across. So one of the things you're going to have to deal with is that sometimes you're going to have a thicker line in one part of your motif than you want. And what we can see here is this one, I'm going ahead and use kind of the spine. The line that I'm following to the curve is going to be my thick line here. So we have a stitch here. We go up and create the center and back down. I go back, create the kind of fin, back across the fin. So the fin has 2 passes, back to the beginning. And then I actually make a small raised stitch here. And if we'll look in closer on this, I actually have a little triangular stitch up and down here because I'm trying to create a little bit of thickness in that stitch right there. I drop a stitch a little bit out and back so that I actually very specifically am trying to create a thick spine along that line that I'm defining for my motif. But what we can see here from looking at the motif line that we've drawn, and we'll go ahead and bring this back out, you can see if I take the stitches off of it that the line is not perfectly being drawn by these motifs. Of course, the straight bottoms of those motifs have to fit as closely as they can. They're fit as closely as they can to that line, but they're not perfect. But what you will see then is that along that line, the beginning point and the end points that I set are going to be on the line that I define. That's generally what we want, because otherwise, if you didn't have it set up like that, and in Brilliance, it's automatic, but in other softwares you may have where you can set that motif differently, you're going to end up jumping to that next point. Most of the time in a motif, it's supposed to be a continuous set of stitches. It's one line of stitches that doesn't backtrack, doesn't jump, doesn't trim. in that case, you're generally trying to move forward in an odd number of stitches, and your start point and your end point are going to be set along the path you will eventually define to track those motifs. So as we can see here, these ones all have a baseline. You don't have to have them like that. And I'm going to show you a set of motifs that doesn't. You don't have to have them that way. And the other thing you can do is have other kinds of motifs that don't work like this. There are different kinds of motifs. But when you talk about a decorative motif that most people understand, this is the kind of thing they're talking about. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring in this other file here and show you a couple of other things, both motifs that I created and some programmatic motifs, right? And some things that are come from the old school annals of digitizing. But here's the thing. We'll go ahead and show these to you real quick. First, the one at the top here, this is actually my particular type of chain or split stitch. If you've ever seen my chain stitch work, like the Viking head that is actually on the title card, and I can actually bring the title card up so you guys can see it again. You see the little Viking heads that are up there, up in this upper right-hand corner. Those are made with this particular kind of straight stitch. And actually you can see, or the chain stitch, and you can see right there by my head that we also have the rings of the different kinds of stitches I used for this particular Paisley motif. And among them is that chain stitch I talked about. Up here is that chain. And I'm actually going to go ahead and I can zoom in on that, and we'll give you guys a better look at what that is. This is what it looks like. I've actually alternated the travel on these because these have one thick leg. Each one of these has a thick leg, and I actually alternated this particular straight line, the thick legs on one side or the other. Sometimes if I'm going on a curve, I will use the thinner, less dense leg on the inside of the curve where it's going to be tighter together, and the more dense leg of this split stitch on the outside edge. It's a conscious choice that I sometimes make. I don't think it makes a tremendous amount of difference in the look, but it kind of does. I think it's enough that I look at it and think about it. Let's go ahead and run through the stitches on this one if I can, and I'll go ahead and bring us up to this actual piece so we can see it. Let's go stitch by stitch. You can see that I'm going out once, twice, down once, twice. Now I go to my travel and I jump back in, and that's one unit. And as you can see, I'm traveling along that middle line, and it's the spine, that's the center where these connect, where I want them to overlap. The way that I want them to track is right in the center of this kind of chevron. And as you'll see, I've actually used 2 copies of this and flipped the alternate copy so that the thick leg is actually alternating on both sides in this particular run. So in this case, once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's it. And then we continue to do that over and over again, tucking in slightly. And as you can see, I talked about density before. Well, what do we have here? This measurement here is very much like the measurement of density, except for that we know we have multiple stitches on this pass. And so these legs are going to be thicker than 1 pass or 2 passes of thread. We will then be able to tell when we're looking at the design what kind of density we get, what kind of coverage we get. But we actually have very specifically, because this is supposed to look like a chain stitch, I have a gap that I'm leaving here on purpose. I want some coverage to be gone here, but I want these to be pretty tight and nest together and look like we have coverage. So that's what those are going to look like. That's what that chain stitch looks like as a motif. But as you can see right there, that piece right here, that is my one unit. And I'm going to define that with manual stitches because in this case, I don't want any breaking of the stitches. I don't want any individual stitch penetrations to happen along those legs. Even if I make this larger, I'm going to limit how big I would make this. Plus, because I have a defined number of passes on each one of these legs, as I get bigger and bigger, it's going to get less dense. They're going to stay the same thickness. These lines will stay the same thickness as I move. And because of that, when I get bigger and bigger, they're going to be less dense. They're not going to have as much coverage. They're going to look a little more sparse. So it may be the case that if I'm using these and I want a really big chain for some reason, I want a really big chevron, then I'm probably going to digitize another one that has more passes than has a thicker line. So as we know, we're still talking about the angle at which these stitches are to each other, and we're talking about how far apart they are and how long they are. It's the same things we have talked about with every kind of stitch type up until this point, and we'll continue to talk about. And that's these. So there's that. I'm going to show you these. These are actually the programmatic stitches that are made by our software, and this is a French knot. But as you can see, we have a little square that repeats over itself and then ends up in this kind of diamond pass and ends in the center and then goes on to the next one. So, of course, what is a real French knot? You're actually making a knot on the surface of the material. What can we do? We're going to intimate the same kind of look by having multiple passes of small stitches on top of each other, so that we build something up that looks rounded because of all the stitches kind of overlapping as they rotate, and that builds some density by building on top, on top, on top of each row of stitches. As we do that, we get a hard little knot of thread, and we get something that approximates the look of what would be in handwork a three-dimensional object. Now it's still three-dimensional, but it would be worked on top of this, top of the piece. We also have some candle wicking here that was done programmatically. So let's go ahead and jump out to that. And here's a candle wick piece. And as you can see, we have a bit of underlay, and then we spin across the top. And these candle wicks are very classic. It's what we've seen done repeatedly for these dots. And this is something that's been in our software forever. So that's what that candle wicking looks like. And as you can see, very much like you would think of a traditional candle wick piece. And then we also have another piece that I have. This is just another one of the this is just a regular motif, the way we understand them. Decorative motif that's kind of a leaf shape. But let's go back to this first piece. This first piece is actually a piece that I like to use. The motif I've used that was actually from kind of Shifley lace. It's a really old school motif called a rosalie. So it's like a little rose. It's a little flower, and I actually like to walk you through this one because you can do satin motifs too. This one has a central dot. We'll go ahead and talk about this. It has a central dot that's horizontal, and then we have these individual petals, and I really love this piece. So I'm going to go ahead and show it to you guys. One petal, and then these overlap as we rotate around the circle. So it makes a dot, but when it's all finished, it looks like a little rosebud, right? It looks like a little layered petaled flower in kind of a geometric shape. So that's a rosalie, and that's another way we can do it. We can have satin motifs that aren't made to chain together, but if you look at where it starts and where it ends, it's made to still roll on a path because it's made for being put down as a scatter, being put down in a line, but you can use these individually, and that is also a motif. A motif doesn't always have to be this traveling motif along a line, but with the advent of kind of computerized sewing machines and embroidery machines, we have thought of them in the way that I showed you further on here, that they generally tend to be things that are on a path on a line. So I think that's interesting to show you guys. I really love the rosalie as a motif. You can use different kinds of motifs to get different effects. And essentially, once again, all we are doing is manually arranging things in a way that's repeatable, that we want to use units over and over again. And that's what the motif really is in essence. But when we're talking about motifs along a path, they are much more like what I showed you before. They're much like the Paisley motifs, where you need to think about your entry and exit very carefully, and you need to understand how they're going to connect from one to the next. So that's how that works. So let me go ahead and bring up that other image that I had to show you real quickly if I can. And this, if I can go ahead and show you, let's see here. We've got this motif repeat that I think is interesting. And I'll just show you again. This is another kind of repeat that I actually helped somebody do. It's a much more traditional kind of sewing machine type of chain stitch. It just depends on how you do it. A lot of people do this kind of chain stitch. And actually, a funny thing about this, let me go ahead and jump this over. This is Jeff's comment. That's interesting. I do my chain stitch a little different. I like that because it looks like you go a little smaller what I can do. Yeah, that's why I did it. That's specifically why I did it, actually, is to go smaller, because this other kind of chain stitch is one that I helped with somebody with this week in trying to kind of sort out how to make a chain that they had on their sewing machine, right? And here's the thing. This is the kind of chain stitch they used. I don't have it sitting here programmed to kind of show you, but I can walk you through it very briefly. It starts here, goes out, goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Super classic chain. It's used over and over as the chain stitch that most sewing machines do. Why do they do it like this? They're not doing anything wrong. They're doing it like this because, as you can see now, each one of these lines was covered a very specific number of times. They don't have the one thick leg like I have to worry about when I'm using my method of doing a chain stitch. However, what do they have that causes problems? They have this stitch here. It means that they can't make a thinner line on that chain because this one has that stitch across the back that as you get thinner and thinner in the chain, it's going to eventually come to a point where you're down to a millimeter and you can't have them get any closer together. You can't make a long and narrow tucked chain or split stitch with it because you'll eventually have this as the limiting factor. This is the shortest stitch, whereas mine doesn't have that short stitch, but it does have one little short travel stitch. For me, I don't mind that very much because it's only one per piece of the design. Plus, in this particular chain, I think that this is too prominent. I don't like the look of this back stitch being so prominent because when I'm doing a faux split stitch, especially when I first started doing it, I was actually, as you saw from the Paisley, I was reproducing pieces that were done on a real traditional chain stitch machine. And they were being done for like I said, Near Eastern fashion stuff is what I got my original sources from that I was working on. And in those, because what you really have is a loop that's being subsided and the next piece is coming through the loop, that back stitch, this stitch that you're seeing here, isn't prominent, isn't shiny, you can't see it. And so I didn't want it to be quite so prominent as it was showing up with this kind of classic chain. Though I do love this, just as that's different from the one I use too. Goes to show you folks, there's a million ways to do a chain stitch. But as you can see, the important things that we thought about here technically are this. Number one, that our start and stop points need to connect along the path that we're eventually going to define. And in this case, we have the width of the overall piece is one thing, but the repeat in this case, because we start here and end here, the base repeat, because we want it to be tucked in, is this distance. And so it is kind of negative. It sets into itself. It overlaps on itself. So it is different in planning that. We need to plan the fact that we're going to have our finishing spot here be the beginning of the next motif. As you can see, our start point here is the end point of the previous motif. And we need to think about the fact that we have this little overlapped area when we're trying to plan these things. So the things that are important for us to plan in this case, number one, that we need an odd number of stitches, or because in this case, we do have an odd number of stitches, but where is the odd number of stitches had? It's here. It's this single stitch that jumps from here that causes the progression. The reason why we don't have any odd numbers in the legs is because we keep going around in this circle. You know, we go in this triangle, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We do that, but we've made the jump from here to here in an odd number. If I wanted to make this center thick, I could jump 1, 2, I could jump from here to 1, 2, 3, jump, and then go do these circles. And I would end up with a nice thick stitch in the center, but that stitch is only there for travel. It really doesn't add to the look, in my opinion. It's not the look that I wanted. And as you can see, if you go back and we can look at my, my type of split stitch, and we'll go ahead and take a look at that again. Let's see here. Let's go back to this one again. You can see that in mine, there is that gap that I'm trying to leave open, and I really don't want that. I don't want there to be a central line here. I want there to be a small gap that's left open so it looks more like a loop, looks more like a traditional split stitch. So it's actually part of what I'm looking for. That's why I'm traveling the way I am. Though what it means is I end up with a long leg here or here. And honestly, there's probably somebody out there who's got a better solution for me than what I'm doing. But certainly I end up with that extra heavy leg on one side or the other. When I have something like in Brilliance where I can actually set different pieces, and I can show you the settings on this particular piece. This one, I actually have 2 copies of my design, but one is flipped along the axis so that I can have the long leg opposite on each one on a straight line. So it really is about that setting and understanding what's going to happen when I have those multiple repeats. But here's the other thing I didn't show you yet. Here's the piece I've been working on just today. And I actually thought about this previously. When you look at traditional chain stitch machines, you see that they fill areas with chain stitch. Now, how they often do it is with spirals of chain stitch. They use kind of a spiral fill where they continually run on top of each other. But I found that when I tried to do this myself, I ended up with more, not only more texture, but more density than I wanted. It was pretty heavy. So this particular piece is me using my split chain to fill an entire area, right? But what I'm doing is manually drawing in the lines. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that this density is not good yet. I have worked on this piece, and this was me doing it very fast because I wanted to kick something out before I did this stuff with you guys today. And this particular piece is not exactly what I would want. This is not the entirety of what I was hoping for. But what you can see is I am filling an area with a motif in such a way as to create a complete fill. Now, what I'm going to say is I need a little more density. I need to work on my spacing. But what we can see here, and I'm going to go ahead and bring myself back up to the full cam. I have some issues here. I actually had a thread break here, so ignore this little bit here. But we've got a little bit too much spacing in here. It looks a little funky, but I did this manually. I didn't do this with a regular spiral. I did it manually. I think if I went back in here and added a couple of passes in here, because I actually changed the number of passes by doing this manually, I think I'd be happy with the texture. The texture is not bad. And what I will say is, if this were on something with a little bit less fuzz and a little bit less contrast, I've got this extremely high intensity blue that is fairly dark on white, pretty fuzzy felt. You can see if you look at its edge on, it's pretty fuzzy. Even with the green screen, you can see it's got a lot of fuzz to it. And that's making some of this sink a little bit more than I would want it to. Unfortunately, the green screen is also picking up on it. But what you can see here is that you are filling with that area. And what I'm going to say is, looking at this, I used a spun polyester thread. So it is close to a 40-weight thread. It is a polyester thread, but it has a little bit of fiber to it, right? Has a little bit of fiber, a little bit of fuzz. This piece looks very similar up close when you're not looking at it under hot studio lighting. It looks very, very similar to pieces done on a chain stitch machine. So it is very interesting in that when people are trying to do things like replicate hand-guided chain stitch work for, say, letter jackets, you're trying to reproduce a historical letter jacket and you got hand-guided chain stitch work, but the customer can't do hand-guided anymore, or the person who used to do the hand-guide is not available, then you sometimes want something you can use with your machine. Now, the thing is, I'm looking at doing this, but instead of just overlapping several times, which you can do and probably should do. I mean, that is really the traditional method of handling this. The other thing I keep thinking is, why don't I use a programmed standard, very light density fill, or maybe a mesh, like the light mesh fill I use for things like toweling, as a background layer to give me some color coverage, and then run this on top to give me the texture that I want. So it's all about filling in such a way that might work for you. And what I'm going to show you again is we're going to bring the software back up. And here's the thing. When we talk about filling an area, generally if we had, let's say that I've got a shape here, and if I was going to draw a shape and, fill it randomly with some fill stitch, right? Here's some fill stitch here. You know that when we're looking at this thing, you know that in Brilliant software, and density, it has this density map that you can get from our DRK, and it shows you densities and says if something's too high or too low. This, of course, is one single layer of fill, so it's not going to be a problem. Looks nice and blue. But then if I grab this thing and I cover it, and I'm going to go ahead and take this guy and cover two pieces together. If I go into my density map now, you see that I'm starting to get some yellow areas. I'm getting some bad fill densities. And definitely if I start putting three of those together on top of each other, you're going to find out that I'm going to get some red zone, right? Now I'm in the red zone. Things are looking pretty rough. But you can see looking at this piece here, that I've actually got some pretty even densities, even with some of the coverage going multiple times because I have multiple strokes on each one of these legs. We have some pretty even densities, and I can kind of look at that and say, I'm still in the general area of having density that looks good. I don't have any sort of density that's going to be too crazy when I'm looking at this piece. And it means that I can go ahead and fill this area knowing that I'm not going to get too heavy, not going to get too crazy dense, and I'm not going to have issues technically with the software or with my machine acting up. Now, this particular piece, I was trying different methods. You can see that I've got some weird kind of curved zigzags down in here that I'm going to look at. I've got some longer passes where I tried to make these long shapes that are very much like a contour. Let's say like I had taken this shape and filled it with a contour. Like, let's say if I grab this out here and go into my software and drop a contour fill inside of it, that might be the kind of thing I was looking for, something like this, and let that guide me as to where I put my manual stitching. People do that all the time. The problem is that it doesn't really account for some of the spacing that's in there. And I think the way to handle that is to digitize some of this manually. And luckily with Brilliance, I can do stitch-based lettering if I wanted to. I could make a cool manual letter like this and then make it typable if I want. However, looking at this, all I really want you to take away from that is that if you go out into, say, the home stores, it's getting to be the holiday season where people are putting up goods. So you see the decor stuff is everywhere, and you see a fill that looks like it was done with a chain stitch machine, that it is not beyond you to take your own work and do something interesting with it. Or as you guys know, I have multiple ways that I've handled this kind of stuff. You may find that you want to do something special with it that is not like this, that is functional. And there are certain things, like I said, there are definitely things. You can see my lines there that I drew. Very different kind of shapes and lines than you would do for a standard drawing setup. And obviously, it is more work. Drawing the lines that you have here is more work by far than just filling it head to toe. But what I'm going to say is this particular look is going to be interesting. It's going to draw the eye. It's going to please the customer. And I think it's a very interesting thing that we can add to our repertoire. And when we make our own motifs, we can actually work on the way that filling happens in ways that we can't do if we're just going to use the standard stuff that's in the software, right? And honestly, there's different things we can do. We use motifs for all kinds of stuff. If I drop a motif in here, we've had that thin motif, right? We did that before, and that's interesting. But we can do the stuff that actually got mentioned before. I've used motifs for things like making faux patch edging, and that's a big thing, faux mirroring. But that's something where honestly, it can probably be done better programmatically. There's different things we might want to do with it later down the road, but we can do things like that. We can use it for things that are functional, and it's something to think about. Like I said, mirroring is one of those things. Some of my mirror testing that's here, and we can see that I have a faux patch edge here. And if I zoom in, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Now, this is only one of many motifs I've used for this one. So it depends on how you're working with it. You can make this thing exactly how it is. You sometimes have to work on the last end, but it looks similar to a mirrored edge. Well, I'm using these stitches and the knowledge of what stitches look like to create the surface that I want. So let's go back to this. We're going to go ahead and finish up. We're into what I would consider bonus time. We're not into what you guys like to call official bonus time on me, since I haven't gone to 15 minutes over just yet. I think we'll get there. I would love to show you guys this. I can't show you this because apparently, once again, I like green more than I thought I would have before the days of green screens. So I can't always show you the samples that I'm looking at, but I do have samples of that kind of faux mirroring that I've done. If you've seen me in person, you've probably seen some of that stuff. That would be handled better programmatically if I could, and that may be something down the road to look at. But currently, I will say that the other stuff I've done, like the chain stitch, the split stitch, the stuff that we did, and actually I will bring that back up in software because I'd like to show that one more time. The stuff that we did, that I showed you earlier for the Paisleys, this stuff is incredibly useful. And all of this work, all of this stuff that people love to see, a massive portion of that stuff is done with these motifs, simple motifs that once you plan ahead and create the tools you need, you can get a lot of value out of them. You can absolutely get where you want to go faster. But let's go ahead and tie this up, right? Let's tie a bow on this. Number one, what kind of stitch types do we actually have in machine embroidery? Well, one. We have a single stitch. We have a line from point A to point B that's solid, made of thread, single color, and that is about it. But what can we do with that? We can define the arrangement of the stitches and their relationship to each other. How close are they together? What angles do they appear to each other? How long are they? And how long are they in concert with each other? How do the penetration points line up when you put row upon row of stitches next to each other? These are the things that we can handle in our software, and they're often handled automatically. But when we're working with motifs, what's important there? Well, when we're working with motifs that are supposed to be continuous, like motifs that travel on a path, which most do one way or another, those motifs, we have to think about our start and end point, how our motifs overlap, and what that gap distance is. We have to think about the fact that we're traveling in one direction. If we're traveling in one direction, that we have to have an odd number of stitches no matter how we achieve that. We'll either have odd thicknesses, as you saw in my split stitch, or we will have a travel stitch of some kind that makes that jump. But we have to have an odd number of stitches to travel from one point to the next, because that's what we have to do. Otherwise, if we had even number of stitches, we travel back. If we want even coverage on every stitch, you may find that you have to pair some manual work, tracing back over some stitches, with the motif stitch you made, or use a different motif and travel back across that same line. There are things you can do, but if you're traveling from one point to the next, you're going to have an odd number of stitches. You need to think about that. And you need to think that where the start point and the end point are, that's where we're going to track along our defined path. Otherwise, we've got jumps and other stuff that we don't really want. If we want a continuous motif, continuous stitching motifs, we're going to be along that path. Other thing to remember is that in these combinations, we can do whatever we want with them. Density is nothing but a measure of spacing between threads, between stitches. And density can be achieved, coverage can be achieved by manipulating groups of stitches in multiple ways. All we're doing is occluding, covering the background of either stitching or our ground fabric with the thread that's in front of it. We can achieve that in any way we want, including drawing path upon path of little straight split stitches like I just did. And we can get inspiration from all over the place. Think about what people did. As you said, Carolyn, her mother did a chain stitch machine. She said that she didn't put circular text inside text, you ran columns like you're showing. So that's kind of cool. So she did columns on her lettering inside text. Good to know that. Thank you for the tip. But that's the thing. Take inspiration from manual work. And she said she would overlap it several times. Absolutely. And with my piece, what you would see in there is that I tucked in so that the little legs of the wedges were on top of each other from row to row, because I know that I'm going to fill in the little gaps wherever I can. Now, don't get me wrong. Do I have some work to do? Absolutely. I can see some hollow areas in here that absolutely need some more rows, but that's why testing is important. That's why stitching is important, to find out what we're going to do. The thing is, I can achieve coverage in any number of ways. Overlap satin stitches gives lovely texture. We end up with a lot of shine. Things like this, that's a texture, it's a more rough texture, but it's a very interesting texture that has grain to it, that has a hand to it, that shows the function of someone creatively deciding how to fill space. These things are interesting. And honestly, whenever we don't just do satin stitch lettering with big flat areas of single angle fill and borders that are solid satins, whenever we don't just do what I call coloring book digitizing, it means our embroidery is going to stand out. It's going to appear to have a higher value. It's going to look more creative, and it will have the hand of we as creators. It'll have our hand on it, our fingerprints on it. And it means that we are consultants, we are part of the process, we are creative, and that will come across to customers, that will come across to people seeing our work. And honestly, if you're looking at two pieces and one is filled with a big flat fill and one is filled with an array of satin stitches that are like facets on a gem, will sometimes people select the one? Yeah, if they want that surface texture. Maybe you want something very regular and mechanical, might be the way to go. But having the option to do both, can you imagine if you can show someone that your range is high enough to say, what kind of finish do we want to achieve? Do we want a handmade look? Do we want a very programmatic, very mechanical look? Do we want a look that is textured and full of shine? Or do we want a very dull, flat look? And if we can achieve all these looks, we can give those looks to our customer. We can provide them with answers to the questions of how they want the design. We can say, these are the looks we can achieve. This is what we can do to make you stand apart, make your design stand apart, and make it important and special for you. So stop and think about this stuff, guys. Remember, stitch types, there's only one stitch. That's why theonlystitch.com has ever been a thing, because I finally, upon someone going over the list of stitch types and trying to teach somebody all the different stitch types, I stopped and said, let's break it down. So break it down to that single stitch. Are you going to programmatically put things in as one stitch at a time? Probably not. Doing it for motifs? Yeah, I recommend using single stitches to make motifs. However, you don't have to program one stitch at a time. You don't have to punch at a 6-to-1 ratio to have stitch consciousness, to know what the qualities of a stitch are that determine the look of the finished object, which determines the look of the finished embroidery. So be conscious of the single stitch. Be conscious that stitch types are only a collection of those individual stitches. And use stitches any way you want to produce that coverage. Don't be limited by the usual way of doing things. All right, guys, with that, that is the end of the take up for this week. I've been so glad to talk to you about this stuff. I've really been enjoying playing with motifs again lately. And I hope that you guys go out there, try out some motifs, try out some different ways of filling space. Like, it's the same as when I talk about anything else, when I talk about dimension, when I talk about getting creative, no matter what it is, even with specialty threads, stuff like that. Go out there and try different ways to make a mark with that embroidery machine that are not the same old, same old. Don't just use the big three. Use everything you can, but have that stitch consciousness. Use every stitch you need, no stitch you don't, and don't be afraid to create a new and interesting texture. With that, I hope you get some time to play this week, and I cannot wait to see you again next Friday.